Narfi stood by the kettle, and when they had finished the boiling, he took up a black pudding and thrust it under Cormac's nose, crying, "Cormac, how would ye relish one? Kettleworms, I call them." This is one of the early references in Norse culture to the presence of sausages. We know that sausages existed all over our period, eaten by everybody, but it is sometimes difficult to find them in the lore, particularly in pre-literate cultures. Sausages are, by definition, a meat finely minced and stuffed along with spices into a casing. In later periods, we see them all over the cookbooks, across a variety of cultures, like Syria, Germany, England, and even Rome. We often think of, at least modern sausages, as being made with the cast-offs of meat, the worst parts. But in period, this wasn't always the case. The wealthy would have had access and would have used fine cuts of meat in order to make their sausage as delectable as possible. Now, there are limits to what we know about how they were prepared. We know that they would have used a variety of meats. We know that boiling would have been a method of cooking them, as displayed right there in that passage, which is from Cormac's Saga. We know the Romans would have used grills to heat them up, to cook them, but we haven't really found any evidence of grills in the Norse world. Presumably, we believe they would have been smoked as well, typically by hanging them in the rafters of the longhouse, and they could have just taken on the ambient smoke from the hearth fire. So what we have to do here is a little bit of experimental archaeology, which is really what we do here in the SCA all the time. So I took vegetables that they would have had in period for spicing. I took pork. I took hog casings because they're natural and would have been used. I fiddled around with the spices that would have been present in early Viking culture based on archaeological finds and occasional references in what literature there is. I also took inspiration from the wonderful book, An Early Meal. It's absolutely fantastic. It's by Daniel Serra and Hannah Thunberg. It's easily findable. I can't say enough about it. I drew the initial idea for the name Kettleworms and that passage from that book, and I expanded it in my original project to worms of smoke and water. In the project I did again for this edition, I was unable to do the smoking because the weather didn't play along. It's been rainy for the past few days. And my initial intent was to cook over a fire. That is to say, I would have used the traditional method with the clay pot and created hot coals through a fire and used those coals to heat the pot and thus boil the sausage. What I did this time was, as you'll see, I prepared the sausage, I minced some, I wound up hand stuffing it because things that went horribly wrong that I'll share after a few initial clips. And I then let it sit in my fridge for 2 days to give it a chance to cure just a little bit. There's a fair amount of salt in there. And hanging sausages is always a good way to combine the flavors. Then I boiled them. Finally, I took the boiled sausages and fried them in a little bit in the cast iron pan just to get some color. Now, would this have been done in period? Possibly not. And last time I did this project, I didn't put them on the grill. But this time I missed kind of the good snap you get after the grilling. And I wanted to experiment, see what the difference is. So let me leave you here for a couple of seconds with some clips I took during the production of watching some of my preparation steps, and then we'll come back to me. Here. So, for today's sausage, what I've got is my chopping station set up here. I've got garlic and leek. Both were very well known in the Viking Age as seasonings, and alliums are a very important choice for sausage. And right here, I've got a pork shoulder. Using a pork shoulder means I won't need to add any additional fat. There's plenty of it already here. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to coarsely chop this, and then I'm going to mince it. So we're going to start here and see how it goes. I've done most of the chopping. Now I'm doing mincing, which I hate. But as I said, would have been the period method. What I'm going to do with this project is I'm going to mince some, grind some, and I'll do it as a comparison to look at the different textures of sausage and how much it changes it. Let's see how it goes. And we're back. As you could see with my initial preparations, it was a bit tedious. We were mincing meat for probably about a good hour to get enough even for the handful of sausages we did that way. I ground the rest of the shoulder because, well, it was big, and I wanted to do a comparison. Once I was past the grind, I mentioned my plan to use the KitchenAid to stuff the sausages in order to cut down on the tedium a little bit. In period, it would have been a horn with a hole at the end, typically from an oryx or an ox, and it would have been pushed through by hand. The KitchenAid efforts went sideways due to a number of reasons. I wound up stuffing them by hand anyway. I did use the sausage stuffer attachment that was with the KitchenAid kit already, and to push through I made use of ye old wooden spoon whose handle was a small enough diameter to push through the sausage stuffer temperature. It was tedious, but it resulted in it packed very well once I got the hang of it. It went a little bit slower, but there was a lot more control over it. And in the minced sausages, there was a whole lot less in the way of air pockets. The minced sausages were boiled and then browned a little, and their texture was, as expected, a little bit coarser. But it was in a really, really positive way. It was nice and toothsome, good mouthfeel. And I think the flavors were a bit richer. I would be hesitant to apply this method for a full feast. You'd be mincing meat endlessly. But for a small gathering feast, it might be an improvement on how sausage is commonly experienced. Let's see what else did I discover. All right. Part of an interesting note with how time-consuming and, well, fiddly the production of the sausage is for some cultures, particularly the Romans, that would have been a selling point. One of the ways they could display their wealth was to serve dishes at their feasts, which were incredibly time-consuming, requiring lots of monotonous detail. It was that way they could show off how many servants they had. You see that with how many sauces they have, with finely ground herbs. It's a conspicuous display of wealth, which was very Roman, and would cycle back around all through period. As you get wealthier, you find ways to show it off. So this was my fourth attempt with the sausage. I've done it 3 times before. The first time was actually for a pensic, in which I used a very similar method, boiling the sausages till cooked, then browning them in a skillet to add a little bit of color. The spices didn't blend terribly well with the meat. There were pockets of leek and pockets of peppercorn, and while that was a pleasing effect in itself, wasn't entirely what I was going for. I think that hanging the sausages as well as grinding more of the spices beforehand, grinding them very, very fine, made a huge difference in just how well the flavors spread through the meat. Then the last trial and the first trial, I used duck fat for an extra fat. I had a less fatty cut of pork, and I added the fat I had in the fridge, which was then duck fat. That had the effect of making the meat actually white, which was a really, really cool detail that you don't get when you just use the pork shoulder. However, the flavors came out a little bit better without it. Duck fat being as rich as it is, you need to season the heck out of what you've got. Other lessons learned and advice for doing this at home. So, be ready to make a mess. There's no way around it. That you'll wind up cleaning your area constantly, but anybody who's been in food service knows that's a fact of life with cooking anyway. The sausage makers make things much easier, but not necessarily better. You get more uniform texture, but there's a very rich flavor to the mince. If anything else, somehow it's meatier. Alliums are important. Oh, something else I did differently this time, which you saw referenced in the videos earlier. This is the first time I incorporated an additional liquid. The cider went very, very well. I mean, apple always goes well with pork. We know that. The cider was also something they would have had in period. We had constant references to apples in the sagas. They were an incredibly important part of culture. And cider would have been drunk in possibly more commonly than ale. But I can't back that up, other than knowing how quickly cider can make and how nice it is when done right. So I use the cider in there. Next time I might try, if I have some extra meat on hand, try that. That should make it even sweeter if I use a sweet mead. A beer might also be interesting. That'll probably give it a little bit more umami flavor. Beer might be what I go with next. Lessons learned this time is keep an eye on your equipment. Things go wrong. Be prepared to roll with the punches and make something happen. I'd also like to use more fresh herbs rather than dried. This already has a really wonderful, fresh, clean flavor to it. But I feel like more fresh herbs will do that magnificently. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to participate in the Golf Wasn't Champions Challenge. This has been a fantastic way to share more about what I know about sausage and the experimental archaeology, and I hope this provides us a chance to explore more about early period food and how it may have been done. Thank you again, along with Merdies.